President Obama became the first sitting president to visit a federal prison and speak directly to 6 nonviolent inmates at the El Reno Federal Correction Institution on Thursday. His focus: opportunities for reforming the criminal justice system.
The United States accounts for 5% of the world's population. We account for 25% of the world's inmates.
Here with the San Diego perspective on this national push for reform are my guest, victim rights advocate and former chair of California's Parole Board, Susan Fisher, and Paul Pfingst, former San Diego district attorney. And Paul, federal prison reform is gaining bipartisan support in California. Among other states, they have some reform already in place here with Proposition 36 and 47. So what do you think this change in attitude toward sentencing appears to be happening? Why?
Well, when I first ran for office to be district attorney in 1994, the #1 issue was crime, the #2 issue was crime, the #3 issue was crime. I didn't test, but I think the #4 issue was crime. People just did not feel safe. As a result, the legislature responded and started putting longer prison sentences on the tab. And ultimately, those chickens have come home to roost with a prison population that exploded. Now the public is trying to address that issue when the #1 issue is no longer crime, and it's not the #2 or #3 or #4 issue. So we have seen crime cut in half. Therefore, the fear of criminals has been cut, and now people are approaching this differently.
Well, during his speech from prison, Obama said a mandatory minimum sentences for drug laws are a major part of the problem. Let's listen.
There's no yeah.
A primary driver of this mass incarceration phenomenon is our drug laws, our mandatory minimum sentencing around drug laws. And we have to consider whether this is the smartest way for us to both control crime and rehabilitate individuals. This is costing.
As a former district attorney, what's your reaction to the president calling to get rid of mandatory minimum sentences for drug users?
If you want to reduce prison populations, that's the place to start, because there are just so many drug offenders inside the federal system. And when you take a look at the mandatory minimums, clearly they're in there for a long period of time. Also close to the president's heart is disproportionate representation in ethnicity inside the prisons, and in the drug laws, that's another good place to start.
Yeah, then Susan, as former chair of the state parole board, what's your take on House Speaker John Boehner's statement that there were many people in prison who just simply don't need to be there?
That was not my experience in California. The people who are in prison in California certainly deserve to be there. As far as the federal prisons, I can't really address that personally. I do know, however, that because someone is in prison for a drug crime, does not necessarily mean that they're not at a risk to public safety should they be released at a time that's too soon and without rehabilitation. So if we're going to release people earlier or have shorter sentences for drug offenses, then we need to address those issues as to what's going to happen if they're back out on the street.
Yeah, and this is where the problem really becomes. It's one thing to say we have too many drug offenders in prison, which is fine. But if they're released, they're going to go back to communities who say we have too many drug offenders on the corner. What do we do with them now? They're selling drugs to our kids. They're selling drugs to this. So these folks are going to be either in a prison or back on the street, and how to deal with that is a very big challenge.
That's what I want to ask Susan here. The focus is on reform, as you were mentioning, these nonviolent drug offenders. What kind of support, what would you support as far as like a prison reform issue, or would you support one at all?
Well, I would certainly want to have a lot of facts before I made any kind of a decision. I think that the president walked in, talked to a couple of inmates, and made a blanket statement with no expertise in criminal justice or in rehabilitation issues. And so what my experience was in dealing with people who were violating parole, who were on the street, was that I couldn't make them stay in a drug program. I couldn't make them rehabilitate themselves. They had to decide that they wanted to rehabilitate themselves. So we can put people in drug programs, but we can't necessarily change their behavior.
And I'm going to have to end this here quickly with you, Paul. So what's the potential impact of this reform, either financially or on crime rates, things that you were just mentioning?
Reducing prison population many of us are for that, reducing extreme sentences and bringing them down, doing more of a gradual stepped-up sentence, many before that. The problem becomes if I'm in a poor neighborhood and I'm in a neighborhood beset by drugs and you're releasing these people and they're coming back to me, am I going to be in favor of having them on the corner? And that's always been the yin and the yang of drugs, prison or back on the streets, and who gets them.
Well, we'll be following this closely. Paul Pfingst and Susan Fisher, thank you so much.
You're welcome.